No, the Dune was all I wanted to talk about today.
Okay, all right.
It's not easy to ask him for this, but it's something that must be done.
It's about my sister. 2 nights ago, she disappeared.
If you find her changed, can you see that her death is without suffering?
You've got some competition. I've hired the Marcus brothers, and they've got a head start on you.
So that's the guy, the Dunpeel Hunter.
D.
She's out of her mind! If you go in there, you're never coming back!
Oh, I'm coming back.
You're dead!
She's here by her own choice, Dunpeel. I suggest you save your sorry ass now and leave us to travel in peace.
I would if I could believe you, Meyer.
You kidnapped the girl.
I'm afraid you have to die.
I want you to stop your protection of Meyer.
You know, you make me laugh. That's a good one.
Someone paid me $100 million to protect my ending. Can you top that?
Well, you drive a hard bargain there, old man. What if I can?
You really are entertaining me, Mr. Stranger.
The whole of Carmilla, the bloody countess.
Your mother was human, but your father was a vampire and you have betrayed his ancient blood. You side with humans against us. Our people are facing extinction, and you're contributing to their demise.
Don't know what it's like, Charlotte, to live forever in darkness eternal, forever thirsting for blood despite your best intention.
Listen, Meyer, the woman says she wants to go back home.
I don't believe it.
Welcome back to Geek Channel 8. I'm Eric.
And I'm Johanna.
I've been listening to this podcast called The Set. And The Set is a podcast about the largest police corruption scandal in New York history that happened in the 90s, mostly in a district in Harlem, the 30, the 30th precinct. And it is absolutely fascinating. Even if you think you know about this story, because it was all over the news, you don't know the full story. And they talk to some of the corrupt cops involved and what was going on behind the scenes. And even the investigation itself, there were 2 parallel investigations happening, one federal, one state. And the 2 investigations didn't get along with each other. It's actually pretty fascinating, and I highly recommend it. It's called The Set.
That sounds great. I love a good podcast. I started reading the book The 3-Body Problem because there's an adaptation coming out that David Benioff, who's a Dartmouth alum, is the showrunner for. He also was the showrunner for Game of Thrones. Benioff, in some of his other work as well, has shown he's pretty good at adapting existing material. And I would say the first several seasons of Game of Thrones that were based on actual written books were pretty great. So I'd say, mid to high level expectations for Three Body Problem, which I've heard is not amazingly well written, but is a page turner and definitely worth checking out. So I'm getting started on it. So far, the world building's pretty interesting. The prose is not the best literature I've ever read, but it is making me excited for the adaptation. So we'll check it out.
I definitely will. I mean, I have the book. I just haven't read it yet. So maybe now's the time I need to do that. This week, we are talking about the 2000 anime film Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust.
So this movie that we're discussing today is the sequel to a 1985 movie, which was based on the first in a long-running series of light novels written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, set in the year 12,090 AD in a post-nuclear Holocaust world, where a young woman hires a mysterious half-vampire, half-human hunter, D, to protect her from a powerful vampire lord. So that's the first story in the series. We're talking about what I think is the third book in the series as it was adapted. So it's a very, very successful light novel series. And when interviewed, Hideyuki Kikuchi said that the graphic novels were heavily influenced by film, including Escape from New York for some of the post-apocalyptic elements, and the character of D heavily influenced by Shane, which I confess I actually haven't seen, but now I'm kind of curious. And that a lot of the battle scenes and the interaction between the hunters and the nobles are based on scenes from the Lord of the Rings, those battle scenes. So drawing on a lot of great popular culture and literature there. In terms of the character D himself, he was inspired by Christopher Lee's interpretation of Count Dracula, and the idea behind this character is they wanted to create someone who has an unearthly beauty and was intended to bring in female fans by virtue of being this seductive and mysterious lead character, and it worked. The completed version of the film we're discussing today was only released theatrically in English, weirdly, and even in Japan. It was released with the English dub and subtitled in Japanese. Fortunately, later on, they released the Japanese language version, which is the version that I watched. I don't know about you, Eric, but I thought that was an interesting bit of trivia. It premiered September 23rd, 2001 in America, which I also thought was kind of interesting timing in terms of some of the post-apocalyptic themes that show up right in the wake of 9/11. And it only played in, like half a dozen theaters. Very, very small release. But considering that, it grossed $25,000 in its initial run, with $151,000 total, making it the highest grossing Japanese film that was released in a language other than Japanese. So these are really tiny numbers. I'm gonna say, this is a real niche film that you found for us. So excited to have an opportunity to watch something that never would have crossed my radar. We've encountered the director of this film in a previous version of the podcast. Director Yoshiaki Kawajiri was asked in 2002, following this film, to direct a segment of The Animatrix. And his chapter, which he collaborated on with the animator for this film as well, his segment was called Program, and was considered one of the better chapters, I think.
I never drink. Why?
So, this is Japanese. We've already done sake twice on this program, so I didn't want to do sake again. Instead, I went with the alcoholic beverage that is gaining a lot of popularity in Japan and around the world, the Japanese liquor-based beverage, plum wine. Still behind sake overall, but it is growing and may one day overtake sake.
I will just say, as a total noob to the sake scene, if you go into the liquor store and you don't do a lot of research in advance, there is a very good chance you will think you're buying sake and accidentally buy plum wine. And it tastes completely different. Like, plum wine is very, very sweet, like almost sickeningly sweet, I find. And I have made this mistake multiple times. So buyer beware.
I have been drinking sake for decades, before I was even legal to drink. So I am into sake. I had never had plum wine before this instance because I knew what to look for. So I never made that mistake before. but I knew plum wine was a thing, and I knew it was often shelved in the sake section. And in fact, I've had that experience of going someplace and there is no sake. There's only plum wine. And I'm like, this isn't sake. You know, yes. I have a couple of sources for this, and I'm just going to say them up front so that I don't have to later. One is a woman named Erin Jamieson, who wrote for vinodelvita.com. And the other is wineenthusiast.com. The first thing you need to understand is that plum wine is neither made from plums, at least what we think of as plums, nor is it wine. Right? So it's kind of a misnomer. Plum wine is actually, and again, I don't know that I'm pronouncing this right, but umeshu, which is a beverage that is made from Asian plums, which are kind of more like apricots. It's a fruit with a pit, and it's extremely bitter. It's technically edible, so you could eat it, but most people would not eat a raw one of these. Its primary use is in making this beverage. One of the reasons it's associated with Japanese culture, even though the fruit itself comes from China, and probably this kind of beverage comes from China too, probably originally, but it grows on the same trees that have the, again, another misnomer, cherry blossoms. So when you see that, that's the tree it's from. So the cherry blossom, of course, is very important in Japanese culture. It's also supposedly has a lot of health benefits. The way that this is done is the unripe plums are harvested, usually in the summer, and the pit is removed. This is usually done by machine nowadays. And then it's fermented, and then there's the addition of sugar to the process, which is one of the reasons it's so sweet. And they're submerged in an alcohol infusion. One thing that further confuses this issue is that alcohol is oftentimes sake, but it is not necessarily always sake. It can be brandy or it can be something else. So according to wineenthusiast.com, umeshu is similar to fortified wines. Translation, Japanese Mad Dog. So I had one called Plum Gekeikan. That's Gekkeikan. It's one of the more popular varieties. It is imported from Japan. It is made, not all plum wines are actually made using that kind of plum. You'll find some where they've substituted other fruits for that, you know, and so you don't know what kind of fruit is being used, and you don't know what kind of liquor is being used unless you look at the bottle. Some of the best, truest Japanese plum wines are made with Asian plums, so it'll still be called plum, and infused using sake. They do add color to some of these, so they do sometimes have artificial colors. I opened it and it took a while before I could take my first sip because, boy, is it pungent. And it has got like a sickly sweet smell to it. And then I started drinking it, and once I started thinking of it in the same way I think of it as Mad Dog, I was like, okay, you could drink a lot of this and get effed up. I'm just going to sip this like it's a port because it is that sweet. It is like a dessert wine. I've heard it spoken of as an aperitif as well, but for me, it's just like, I'm just going to like sip this after dinner, which is what I did. So my pairing recommendation for Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust is Japanese plum wine.
On the other hand, I would recommend Japanese whiskey for this, especially if you are like a fan of scotch and you like smokier kinds of things, just because of the flavor of the movie. There is nothing saccharine or bubbly or sweet about what we're about to talk about. So I don't know if I could have done it, Eric, but power to you.
One of the downsides to the pairings is I have to decide what I'm drinking before I see the movie. So had I been remembered Bram Stoker's Dracula had an absinthe scene, we would have been talking absinthe. I had not seen it, so we did couple of vineyards Merlot. Had I seen it beforehand, I might have chosen a Japanese whiskey, but I didn't, so I went with plum wine, which it works. It just you gotta sip it. Don't chug it. It's really sweet. Anyway. So this takes place in the distant future. The future that we get, it's kind of like a samurai, post-apocalyptic Western horror movie.
Yeah.
Did I get all the genres in there?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's not a musical. We could say it's not a musical.
Yeah.
But the samurai elements come through really strongly.
So I saw the first film, Vampire Hunter D, like when it came out in the 80s. It came out in like 1985. This sequel didn't come out until 2000, so it came out a long time after the first film. I don't remember the first one very well.
The animation was pretty low budget on the first one, and my understanding is the real demand for the sequel was fan-based, and it just took a while for that fan-based enthusiasm to percolate, but that the first one had been done on a shoestring budget, and so the animation was more like TV quality and not up to the anime quality of feature films of that time even. And so there was a lot more effort put towards the animation and the production budget for this film.
But from what I've seen fans posts online and stuff like that, this one is much more highly regarded than that one. It begins with a woman named Charlotte, who is very pure brunette. Again, for some reason, the brunettes are pure. She is abducted by a vampire, Baron Meyer. And her father sets up this meeting in this like ruined, looks like an old Spanish mission or something, like from a...
Yes, right out of a Western.
Right out of a Western.
All you needed was the tumbleweeds.
And riding in is our dark stranger, D, who is a half human, half vampire hunter, just like Blade, a Dhampir, which they call in the English translation of this a Dunpeel for some reason. I have no idea where they got that name. Anyway, he hires him to rescue her, or at least bring her body back, dead or alive. He is totally willing to have D kill her if she's been turned into a vampire. Her brother, meanwhile, hires the Marcus brothers, which are Borgoff, Kyle, and Nolt. They're a different kind of vampire hunter. They don't ride a horse. They ride around in a tank with a giant cross on the front of it.
It was so cool. That was one of the, like, immediately I'm like, what is this thing? It's like a train, but not a tank is a better description of what it is.
Yeah. And they also have a couple of associates, Grove, who is this Professor X psychic type guy, and a woman named Leela. They're hired by Charlotte's brother to also, bring her back. Meanwhile, Meyer and Charlotte it seems to be are eloping or something like that. You're not sure at the first if she's under his power because he's a vampire or if she's going willingly. This gets back to our whole thing about like, what does consensual even mean when we're dealing with vampires? He's being pursued by all these hunters. So he hires what's called the Barbaroi, which are werewolves, to protect him.
Werewolves is just sort of the starting point. One of the coolest things about this film is all of the imaginative variations on what these mutants can do. Like, one of them has like a mouth coming out of his chest, and, you know, some of them, you know, can spin vines or turn liquid. Like, just some of them can, you know, move along in shadows. Just like a ton of different kinds of powers that these Barbaroi have that allow for it to continue to be exciting and interesting.
You get a lot of Western tropes. I'm not going to go into this plot point by plot point, but there is a scene where he goes to buy a horse and then the town wants to kill him. You know, the sheriff shows up looking for him, which the sheriff was tipped off by Leela that he was there. And everybody hates him because he's a damn peel in this, except the guy that actually runs the livery, who turns out was a child that was rescued by him from vampires many, many years earlier.
This reminded me of like a samurai film trope. He's the samurai who's come to town. Everyone else in the village is distrustful, but then there's like one character who delivers this very moving monologue about, you know, how important the samurai is, or, you know, anyway, it was good flavor.
It's a very complicated plot, as a lot of animes are, especially ones that are condensing like years worth of light novels into one movie, you know? So yeah. It's definitely made for the fans. So if you don't already know the story, it can be difficult to follow. There's a lot of encounters between these various factions, and eventually it ends up with most of the Marcus brothers dying. Everybody dies in this.
Yeah. But in awesome ways. So many awesome deaths. Like, really, really beautifully rendered. Fun.
A lot of it comes to a standoff on a bridge where the carriage is going to cross the bridge and they're going to blow the bridge. This is another Western trope, except for instead of a train, it's the carriage here. And Meyer escapes with Charlotte and they finally reach their destination, which we find out is Lady Bathory's castle.
Countess Carmilla. Yes, I noticed that. I was like, aha.
Carmilla Bathory. So like conflating it again, the way that Dracula brings in the origin story of Vlad Tepes, this conflates Carmilla with the origin story of Lady Bathory, the real person who was the inspiration for Carmilla. A long story short, she has a spaceship that they're going to try to escape to the stars in.
Yeah, which when that showed up, I was like, oh my god, wait, it's a Western sci-fi, it's a Western samurai vampire film that's going to space? What?
Yeah. So basically, the whole thing ends up as a very tragic love story. I'll let you watch it if you're interested to find out, do they escape or not together. It is definitely a bit of a star-crossed lovers thing. But also, Dee and Leela end up spending a lot of time together as well. And they make a pact with each other that whoever dies first, the other one will lay flowers on their grave. Spoiler here, they both survive the story here until many years later, Leela, being human, dies, and Dee shows up at her funeral, and the world does not look dystopian anymore. And he lays flowers on her grave. But he's confronted by her granddaughter, very young granddaughter, who sees him and asks about him and did you know my grandmother and that kind of stuff. I mentioned this mostly because I wanted to say that I'm usually a fan of the Japanese version of these. I own this on digital media, but unfortunately I own it in English, so I had to watch the dubbed version. And the voice of the granddaughter was, the English voice was by Debbie Derryberry, who, if you watch any animated stuff, especially anime, she pops up all over the place. We've already heard her on this show in Disney's Tarzan and in Animatrix, possibly in some of the other animated stuff we've watched too.
Yeah, apparently she also voiced Coco Bandicoot in the Crash Bandicoot video games, which is awesome.
Okay, couple little things I wanted to pull out here. Again, we have some weird injecting going on. This is like the third week in a row we got some weird injecting thing. I don't know what the point of this is, but they injected Grove with stuff to sort of bring him to life or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to ponder. Like, in the original novel, one of the reasons why the blood transfusion stuff is there is because it was a hot button issue at the time, that, you know, that it was considered possibly immoral to put another person's blood in you. Like part of it was God wouldn't have intended there to be these kind of scientific blah, blah, blah. But some of it was that there was like a weird sexual element to it that people felt very uncomfortable with. So I understand why it's in the original novel. I, like you, am not sure I understand why there are these like fascinating scenes in all of the other Dracula related adaptations with injections, like either of drugs or of, you know, leeches, like whatever.
I don't know. It's definitely a trope that has crept in somewhere along the line. Another thing I wanted to mention is, for no known reason, Dee has a symbiotic sidekick, which is his hand.
Yes!
I have no idea what. It's pretty left field. The hand has some really comedic lines. My favorite one being, "What's the sound of one hand yapping?" So yeah, he's literally got this little face on his hand that talks to him and stuff like that. I have no idea what that's all about, but
it was pretty creepy, but also like a Deus Ex Machina that I was totally willing to allow to happen. You know, just like, oh, you're having a problem? Like, oh, the little guy on my hand is just going to suck that problem away.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Even though it's convoluted, I definitely liked it. I don't know if I'm going to watch it again to really understand it, but, you know, I love a good genre blend. This did not disappoint in that area. The animation is gorgeous, and it was just endlessly inventive and creative, even though, like, I would not watch this if you were trying to watch it for the story. Like, impossible to follow. But for the artistic touches and, you know, kind of just the flavor of it, the feeling of watching it, excellent.
Do you know why I picked this?
I mean, I assumed that the vampire hunter D, like, that there's sort of a sense that he is Dracula, but has just switched sides. Is that the lore that we're going with?
Close. He's a Dhampir. So he's not a vampire, he's a Dhampir. He's half human, half vampire, as I said at the start.
Yeah.
What does D stand for?
Dracula.
Yeah. So it's strongly implied he is the son of Dracula and Mina.
Ooh.
They never say it expressly, but that's the implication. There's a lot of hinting at it. And they do say that his father was the king of vampires and blah, blah, blah. So
yes,
that is there. Yeah, the implication is that he is the Dhampir, half human, half vampire son of Dracula and Mina.
Got it. Okay. I was curious how this fit into the arc. That makes sense. And just speaking of the vampire element, I mean, we talked a lot about the Barbaroi and the mutants and some of the other vampire hunters. But the way the vampires are rendered in this is very cool. Like, I love the scene at the beginning when the guard transforms into a vampire. Like, you think that he's, just a drunk, and then suddenly flashes fangs. Like, very cool the way it was done.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that about wraps it up for this one. If you liked the show, please subscribe. Let somebody else know about it. We live and die by word of mouth. If you want to communicate with us directly, the best way is by email. We are GC8 Podcast. That's letter G, letter C, number 8 podcast at gmail.com. Until next time, this is Eric.
This is Johanna.
Signing off.